This is coming into Antonio Salemi's studio. Park the car, get out, walk around the house. We're greeted with the sculptures and the relief bronze on the side of the small schoolhouse. Wonderful compositions. Relief is a very mysterious art form, presenting three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional surface in clay. Portrait of Anita Dabona, friend of Antonio's. Dwight Eisenhower. He sat for this portrait, and one was put on the battleship installed there of the it's called the Eisenhower, I guess, USS Eisenhower. Everything he does is imbued with a wonderful sense of presence. Nothing is literal. It's all done in sculptural values, and yet captures the essence of the subject matter. Torso in a sun-drenched landscape. So we'd go over to his studio a few times a week. I would, and a friend of mine, and hang out and ask questions and look at art. But this was his yard. Totally compelling and attractive space. That's Eve. Really remarkable. Antonio died in 1995 at the age of 102. His wife still lives here. It's an old converted schoolhouse that they bought in the 60s sometime. And he put the studio on the top floor. And surrounded by a couple acres of yard. They lived simply, but created a really wonderful space here. So this is what greeted us when we came over to visit with him. And then we got to go up into the studio. Now these I did probably around 1993. I call them studio views. And I just stood in one place in the middle of his studio and panned basically from a few different angles what it looked like. Well, there were paintings and sculptures everywhere. Heads. That's the head of Thomas Coward. I'm not sure what he did. This is Charles Blockson, who is the curator of Black History at, I believe it's Rutgers University. Temple it might be. The head of Paul Robeson. Tony was friends with Paul Robeson back in the 20s in New York City. Portraits. These are what he calls environments. This is part of a series of environments called the Ox Herding Story. There's more modern, contemporary, free style work. But I just felt his studio was a completely remarkable place. The head of Kali, the head of Kennedy, you can see there in the background. Kali is the Hindu goddess, mother of the universe. like I said, his walking into his studio to me was like walking into one of the secret chambers of the pyramid, something of that order. It was always a place of magic for me. Ida Rolf, the originator of the Rolfing. That's Edgar Casey, head of Edgar Casey. Heads lining the wall, figures in progress, male, female, relief, small sculptures, portrait of a woman named Edith. Unbelievable. And all this crammed into that fairly small space. Bust of a young woman. Totally awesome sculpture. Like I say, Antonio can't be classified as a realist. His work is truly sculptural and modern in a classical sense. There he is with his wife Martha. Like I said, Martha's now 90 and living in this house yet and struggling to deal with preserving the collection of work here. Lots of issues. It was left to a foundation, the Antonio Salemi Foundation. And she seems to kind of be at the center of that at the moment. Not a whole lot going on. Kind of tragic in a sense. That's the head of Swami Vivekananda. Yeah, Tony was about 100 years old in this when I took this video. Another view. You can see it's just dense with painting and sculpture. That closet's filled with paintings, portraits, landscapes. He studied as a young man with George L. Noyes, who was a student of Monet. He studied sculpture in Rome. That's a portrait of Ethel Waters, who was a Broadway and early, an actress. His portraits of Martha there, wedding portrait, totally beautiful, classical. His mother-in-law could have been Rembrandt painting that portrait. Woman named Lee Oliver. These are all early portraits. This is the sculpture. I mean, he did it all. That's a small environment. He called a lot of what he did in sculpture in later years was he called environments. The portrait in the back there is a man named Gerald Hurd, who was friends with Aldous Huxley and Christopher Isherwood. They were kind of a trio of sorts, all writers and philosophers. And that was Tony's first guru. He did a beautiful portrait of him. When they first got together, Swami Brahmananda in white there, his rendition of Shiva, and there you can see some environments. Winston Churchill, the head of Gerald Hurd in the middle there. I don't know who the guy is on the right. I always like this shot though, beautiful. Some more environments and small figures. And there's the master at 100, hanging out in his studio, getting very little recognition or attention for a lifetime of work of the highest order basically both sculpture and painting and draftsmanship. So that's a introduction to Antonio and his studio. He was a great man and a good friend.